I'm here with Dr. Ben Voth, a professor of rhetoric and director of debate and speech programs at Southern Methodist University. He's the Coolidge Foundation Debate Fellow and an advisor for the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas. Dr. Voth's professional mission is to equip individuals to have their voice by teaching and researching in areas of rhetoric, argumentation, debate, and public speaking. Dr. Voth accomplishes this mission with a variety of audiences. He's worked with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum with dozens of Holocaust survivors, more than a dozen national collegiate champions of speech and debate, North Korean dissidents, Burmese dissidents, the Rwandan national debate team, and a variety of corporations and organizations throughout the United States. Dr. Voth also judged me at a professional debate contest early in 2024. Dr. Voth, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm very happy to do this with you, Ian. Thanks for the invitation. This is fantastic.
Well, sir, you've had a long and storied career as a debate coach. My first question to you, how has your understanding of rhetoric and persuasion evolved throughout this career?
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty significant question, and I've been doing this for over 3 decades. And I think the biggest change for me is something that's rather classical in the study of rhetoric and argument, and it's a debate between Plato and Aristotle about what the ultimate purposes of rhetoric were going to be. And of course, they're still debated today in the 21st century, but about sort of a cynical outcome, like, are we doing all these things with words and persuasion to achieve only selfish ends that frankly could be unethical? Or is there some idealistic possibility, some better world that's more than just each individual alone, but some greater, higher good? And I think Plato and Aristotle kind of really went to blows about that. I think Aristotle's notion of ethos, where the character of the person matters in argumentation, is an important way of him responding. And for me, as a young person, I think I had a bit of a competitive sense, maybe coming out of my debate experience, like, hey, I'm just doing this for myself, do anything to win. Any strategy is legitimate as long as I win. But I really think I have changed in my thinking that there's an idealistic purpose to rhetoric where we can make things better for humanity as a whole. And that's why I got really oriented around, for example, the Holocaust Museum that you mentioned in the intro, that in order to prevent things like genocide, in order to heal from that, we've got to have a bigger picture than just the self-interest or let's persuade for only selfish ends. And I think that's been the big change for me over the decades.
How does that translate to your coaching philosophy?
Yeah, and so for me as a coach, our program is actually really unusual. And I've always said I'm not opposed to what I'm about to say. I've never had scholarships the entire time I've been a director at the collegiate level in different places. And I think many programs rightly offer to the best high school debaters and speech students a scholarship, and that helps build their program. But we don't have that. And I really pride our program and my philosophy in trying to help anyone do speech or debate. And honestly, as again, the years have gone on, I've tended to pride myself on trying to work with people who are the most resistant to speaking, the people who are most afraid to speak. And yeah, even elevating them to the status of a national champion, people that ironically are able to become really good. I always point out, like here at SMU, we have 7 different schools of sort of expertise, but we've had more national champions from the engineering school than any other school. Now, that's not probably the school most people would predict where you'd get great public speakers, but I've always been very ironically directed. Even just in a classroom, I'm really trying to identify who is that person that is most afraid to speak, who is that person that wants to be silent. And I'm always aiming to help essentially the weakest or the most marginalized person from a communication standpoint. And our program is very much behind that. And I think that's made it a lot more interesting and a lot more fun all the way around.
Let's say you find that speaker. The speaker doesn't really want to communicate. You've identified them as the weakest from that standpoint. But then the speaker starts competing in debate contests and they lose. They're losing to people who might be better at sophistry than they are. They lose to people that might be better at stretching evidence, misrepresenting arguments. How do you keep that person on the straight and narrow per that conversation with Plato and Aristotle?
Yeah, no, that's a very tough thing. And I've often said, and I'm pretty serious about that, and we don't do what I'm about to say, but I've always wanted to have an award for the person who lost the most debate rounds because there's a tenacity to that person that they could be enduring exactly what you just said, that they have lost a lot of debate rounds. But some of what I do in terms of framing our program, for example, our program is framed around a guy named James Farmer Jr., whose nickname was the Great Debater, but he was an African American civil rights activist. He debated at Wiley College here in Texas, but he was actually an alternate on the debate team. And he is in a fairly famous movie that Denzel Washington created with the same name, The Great Debaters. But the thing is, and I would tell our debaters this, he was not a superstar on that debate program. He was not their best debater by any accounts. But the skills that he enjoyed and sort of developed, even in a limited way, not as the top winner, became very important to the well-being of the United States. And I do a similar thing with Calvin Coolidge. I work with the Coolidge Foundation. Calvin Coolidge was a very unassuming young man, and nobody was really picking him out of Plymouth Notch, Vermont, to be this great leader, let alone somehow president of the United States. But in Amherst College, he did debate in one classroom debate, and it transformed him. He wrote home to his dad and said, "Hey, this is just really fun and really engaging." And I always try to appeal both to those historical stories and just the feeling of that, the exhilaration of debate. Whether you win or lose, you realize that you're having a much more dynamic educational experience than somebody that's just sitting in the classroom taking notes and then repeating it by rote to some authority. I think students can gravitate to that enthusiasm and that dynamic, whether they're winning or losing. But it is a serious challenge that you've mentioned.
You mentioned Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. I remember the anecdote where Dorothy Parker hears of his death and then remarks, "How can they tell?" Very much a man of few words. What I
Yeah.
heard you say there was you care a lot about the student's experience, such that if they're losing, it might not matter so long as they're getting those skills of becoming a better rhetorician.
Yes.
If the judges aren't seeing that, in what ways did they start seeing it in themselves?
Wait, can you repeat that last part again?
Sure. If the judges aren't seeing that, in other words, if their win-loss record isn't changing, how do they start seeing that growth in themselves? Because there's plenty of debaters that only judge themselves by their win-loss record.
Yeah, we try, especially at SMU, and really everywhere I've worked up in Ohio when I was a director, I really tried to make our program more than just the tournament competition, which it is an important part and it is a backbone part. But we always have, for example, public debates. And those are not really in the strict, like you say, judging result and ballot. Now, we do public surveys where we ask the audience to vote on campus and things like that. But we try to get all of our debaters to do those and to understand the civic components of what we're doing, that there is a civility that we're trying to master that goes well beyond whether they're winning or losing. And this is the ironic part, the tenacity to where, honestly, there are unsavory, unethical individuals who will do things for any reason in order to obtain power. The only check to that is a patient, persistent person who frankly doesn't really care about winning and losing to stand and do that. And again, I can go into written a book about it, literally like James Farmer. That's literally what happens with this man's life after he's a college debater. We also do a lot of community service work. We do things. We work internationally, like you're pointing out, like in Rwanda. And I'll be going to Nigeria in 2 weeks to train debaters. So we give the students a broader perspective than just the ballots they're getting back from the judges of the tournament, which are important. And there are just a lot of social interactions that we have on the campus that are more than just whether the judge liked us or not.
You mentioned civic debate in that answer. I'd like to pivot a little bit to the debates that a lot of us have seen. Maybe we've never competed in high school, collegiate, professional debate divisions, but we've seen presidential debates or gubernatorial debates. What do you see as the key similarities and differences between competitive debate and these political debates?
Yeah, and that's such an important question, and one which I've spent a lot of time both researching and publishing about. And first of all, I just think it's really important that we do have those debates in civil society, even though, and that's what we're going to kind of detail here, there are important differences that exist between these political debates that we witness. And honestly, even this distinction has changed over time. I have complained literally for decades about one fundamental difference, which was, and this is surprising, but that in many cases, probably most cases, the candidates don't receive equal time when they speak. And that's one of the simplest things that I've sort of appealed to over the decades of research. It's like, look, to give it a greater semblance of fairness and intuition as to being an actual debate, we need to have equal time for both candidates or whatever number of candidates are there. And by the way, that could be another thing that is sort of surprising. One of the civil things we've done here at SMU is like we sponsored a Democratic gubernatorial debate where we had 7 candidates on a stage. Well, that's complicated. Instead of like basically 2 sides debating, how do you let 7 people do that? So you have that. The other big thing, and I've complained a lot about this over probably the last 10 or 12 years, is that there are typically moderators in these political debates. And those moderators exercise a much more intrusive rhetorical role than what you and I know from a tournament perspective of a judge sitting at the back of the room adjudicating. And quite honestly, and I've documented this, this has hampered, I would say, the larger civility that one could achieve if political debates resembled actual academic debates as we might imagine. So I would probably start with those 3 things. There are many other things that I could point out that are different that maybe we should pursue. I'll leave it up to you. But those are 3 things that I have written about and talked about, both in editorials and like The Hill and also book publications. But those are important.
There's a lot of threads to pull on. Let's start with the equal time in these debates. I think that the more I watch the modern one-on-one debates, the more I notice that there are shot clocks that are running, and at the end they'll publish if candidate Y had a few extra minutes over candidate X. I think it's really hard for them to do this when you had things like the 2020 Democratic primary, where there were 10 plus people on the stage all at once, and whoever was loudest or seemed to be the front runner is going to get the most questions. How can that be resolved?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've heard that many times, and I've done a bunch of radio interviews almost like this, where we get into this. But the harsh thing that I say, again, for doing this for 3 decades, like, look, I've gotten 5th graders to do this. All right. And people say to me all the time, like, well, it's really complicated. And these people really want to do it. And by the way, and this hasn't happened a lot, I've offered consulting help like here in the Dallas area, and I did actually moderate a debate between Colin Allred, our local Democratic House rep, as he went through the Democratic primary process. And even he kind of tried to wrestle the time kind of away from me. But I think there are ways, and we have discovered these very recently, I think in the last 2024 set, like you can turn off the mic. I mean, and that's harsh, but that is a reality that undergoes like, okay, this is actually not hard. Okay. And then, yeah, when you go back to your original premise, when these 7 primary candidates are up there and you give one candidate 15 minutes and you give another one 3 minutes, there's really no way to rationalize that as a fair opportunity and a comparison of viewpoints. And again, I go back to the example that we did here at SMU in 2018 with the Democratic candidates. We had 7, and I absolutely strictly gave each person the same amount of time. The microphones turned on and off. And I think in the end of it all, everybody realized that that was much more of a semblance of a debate than just the uncontrolled, I'm a strong personality, I want to dominate, so therefore I'm going to talk more. And I think the harsh thing that we have to come to grips with is that the mediators of these debates are actually allowing the process to get off the rails. It's not the kind of inevitable story that we've been told. And honestly, this is good news, in my opinion. Over the past 15 years, the progression toward equality of time has actually increased significantly. And really in 2016, I would say that was the first time a presidential debate came close to being equal time. In the head-to-head one-on-one, not so much those primary ones that you premised the question on, there is a trend toward equal time, and that's actually a good thing. Also showing that what they were saying before, like, oh, we can't do it. Yes, you can. And we need to go further. I think your premise is correct.
I'm really interested in the moderators cutting the mics, but then letting the mics come back on when they feel like they're about to get a strong TV moment. For example, there's the Alley Cat exchange that Biden and Trump had during the debate last June. And
Yes.
there also was the Gulf exchange. As I recall, I think at least one of their mics was shut off. Then they realized something was going to be interesting and they let both mics go on to get what was a quasi-viral moment. What are your thoughts on that? So long as we've got this profit motive, they want to sell ads, they want to get eyeballs on the screen. Seems like they're probably not going to go as strict and as full of integrity as you did when you were moderating. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you're noticing that. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people are, but that's so on target and exactly right. And I always say to my students, and really even in my books and writing, like, we're talking about audiences of 50 to 100 million people. Only the Super Bowl has bigger audiences than these debates that we're talking about. And in one sense, that's really exciting, even at a civic level, that people would want to tune in like that. But then that does create exactly what you said, like the money, the advertising dollars that represents is so enticing that, yeah, you kind of want to turn on those mics. Now, here's my solution. And I've been very adamant about this for over a decade because of what our background is. I'm like, it's called cross-examination. You let the two people cross-examine each other. The hot things that are happening here that even you talked about in that June debate is the two parties wanting to directly examine one another's claims. And that's intuitive to debate. But for some reason, we have strictly vested the questioning process with the moderators. And honestly, and this is a little bit kind of weird to confess, but I kind of got into a bit of a spat with a journalism professor about this because I complained that, look, we shouldn't have the journalist asking the questions. We should let the contestants directly question each other. And there was actually a moment, I think it was in 2020, where Mike Pence asked a question to Kamala Harris about the Supreme Court. And it was just something that happened because of the time. And he sort of ventured off topic and gave cross-examination. And then they let her answer. But see, if they had structured cross-examination, which you and I are familiar with, I think you'd see a venting to the problem that is sort of underlying it. These two people want to go after each other directly. Well, let them do it. And I think, again, I keep being told, like, well, chaos would reign. I'm like, okay, we've seen junior high kids do cross-X and do it pretty good. So I think we need to give this a try. And to be very blunt, it's never been tried. And again, in 2018, in our experiment, we did let the candidates ask each other questions. And again, the mics can be turned off, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's a venting process that solves some of the problem that you're correctly identifying.
You talked about cross-examination a lot there. I agree with you. I noticed there's a measure of cross-examination, a degree of it, in the Canadian debates. When they have those leaders debates, they're allowed to ask at least one targeted question to each other. Generally, the two frontrunners, normally it's the Liberal, the Conservative, will ask things of each other. Then they're needled on the side by the other candidates. How much would you let it go on if it's a one-on-one debate between the Democrat and the Republican here? How much cross-X?
Yeah, great question. And here's my simple answer. And again, a lot of this has to do with some of the consulting that I do. I really literally want to sit down with candidates and say, and not even just to the candidates, but to their campaign managers, all the stakeholders who are really nervous about the ramification of a debate, and just say, what is mutually agreeable to the two of you? And we do this when our public debates. We're like, you want to have a 1 minute cross-examination period, 2 minute, 3 minute, we want to have a 5 minute. Like we just did a public thing for the ACC debates where the cross-examination period was 4 minutes long, which is unusual. But that format decided for public debate purposes that 4 minutes was the kind of dialogue that they wanted to have. But I think we could ask the campaigns, what opportunity do you want your candidate to have to directly examine? Now, I will say, and this is maybe a little bit of a criticism of the Canadian system, and I don't mean it as a criticism. I just think that it's good. Part of my criticism of parliamentary debate generally is like, yes, it's very reflective of the European models, but we need to have debate styles that fit the American political models and things like that and what would happen. Now, for them, this is what happens in Parliament, but there should be something that is a semblance, which, by the way, I work with the Reagan Foundation as well. They have their own series where it is a little bit predicated on these debates that we're talking about. The high school students have to act out as if a media moderator is asking them a question. So we should ask realistically, especially to the campaigns, how do you want this cross-examination to go? How many minutes will it be? What are kind of the stipulated expectations? Is it only that you ask questions and the other person answers? You could create those stipulations in a mutual setup, I believe, of the debate.
One more thread to pull on, and that's how intrusive the moderators should be. There's been a lot of push on the left to have moderators fact check more. On the right, I think that because we haven't seen major right-wing pundits host these mainstream debates, I wouldn't really call Chris Wallace, for example, in 2016 a right-wing pundit, I think pretty much a centrist at that time. And then you see perhaps the Hannity moderation of the Newsom versus DeSantis debate, which is as right-wing framed as it could possibly come with every question. It's hard to know, what does a neutral look like when we live in a media ecosystem where I'm not sure we have a shared definition of what the neutral facts are. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, no, that's great. And by the way, I have a Hill editorial that gets into this online that people can look at. And again, the simple thing is, and I guess it's a little bit complicated, so let me get into the background a little bit. When you look at the trend data, which I have on moderators, we've gone from around the turn of the century at 2000, moderators consume 5% or less of these 90-minute debate intervals. When you talk about Chris Wallace in 2016, he had crossed over the 25% threshold. Now, I had been saying since 2012, like, if we don't get a handle on this fact check thing, these moderators will consume vast portions of the debate. And they will be, we can say whatever we want, conservative, liberal, they will be making arguments, okay? And that's not typically what we want in a debate. We want the candidates to make the arguments. And that's where, again, cross-examination is the right approach. Like, let them kind of go at each other instead of the moderators. But it was Candy Crowley who, in 2012, in my opinion, just sort of unleashed with this thing, like, hey, it is virtue on my part to claim that certain people are making fact errors, and I'm just going to flat out fact check. And she started that in 2012, and it has become unbridled. And it is, of course, saddled with everything you're saying. But, well, the conservative person says this, the liberal person says this. Okay, only thing we can do in a debate is let them mutually have an equal opportunity. That's what I'm saying. Negotiate with the campaigns and say, how is that going to go? And so for me, the answer is a very strict limit on these moderators. But which, by the way, I feel like in 2024, for the first time, that trend data that I was talking about, like, it went back down. They stayed under 10% of consumption of the debate time. Because what I was saying up to that point is, like, there are no rules for the moderators. There are no rules for the moderators. Like, it's a crazy thing. So I think whatever the answer is, and I've given mine, which is to, like, have severe limits on the moderators. Like, okay, if we can't do that, then tell the moderators what they can do. You can go this much time, because these long-winded questions that they're asking, which are really just speeches sort of masking an argument, they're not really necessary. And again, I'm going to give the model here. In our 2018 gubernatorial debate, I literally said, immigration, go. I'm not there to frame it and, like, well, you did this 10 years ago. And I make a joke in class where I say, imagine that you are in some sort of public debate performance and the moderator has your entire high school record in front of them, and they detail, as long as they want, all the mistakes you made in high school. And then they turn to you and say, please give us a 2-minute answer, go. There's no way. None of us can answer in 2 minutes all the mistakes we made in high school. Okay. So giving moderators unchecked, in other words, no time limit, set up, and then saying, oh, well, your answer for 2 minutes was completely insufficient. Oh, no kidding. Right? Yeah, of course that's right. So I want severe limits on the moderators, but in a worst case scenario, some limits, like, okay, can't use more than 10% of the debate time with your pontification, whatever it is, conservative or liberal. I think we'd get much better civic results.
That's very interesting to me, in particular, because the moderators have been made a foil by several candidates. I think back before the Candy Crowley moment with Mitt Romney, I think about Newt Gingrich getting asked about his infidelity.
It's backfired a million times, exactly the way you're saying.
Yeah. And I was wondering, because Trump in the 2015-16 primaries did a whole lot to play off the moderators. There's the famous moment with Megyn Kelly and also the audience. And I thought, well, if Trump doesn't have the moderators there, would he be as successful? And the answer is maybe with cross-examination. If he still is directly attacking Jeb Bush and trying to hobble the Bush family, perhaps he still gets those moments off. And if we can't trust the candidates to ask the very aggressively framed questions instead of the moderators, then how effective are these candidates as rhetoricians to begin with?
Right. No, and I think that was the hard-nosed, and it's honestly right now, it's still a hard-nosed question, but when you're talking about that June 2024 debate, that was the harsh reality. The debate because they did frame some things to say like, well, we are going to turn off the mics so that, and to be blunt, so that Trump is under control. Well, it still did expose that Biden was not really prepared to rejoin things that had just been said. And we all know, and everybody's re-examining it right now, in the first 20 minutes of that debate, it just seemed like Biden was not equipped to carry out the rhetorical function of a candidate. And that's the problem. And it is a germane problem. Now, I admit, I don't think it should be the exclusive demand of a candidate, but it is a substantial demand of a candidate. And they should be able to do what you just predicated in that question. And debates are the best way to establish that, fair debates. I got a lot of ideas about how to do it, and I've written about it, but I love that you're asking about it because I think it's really, really important.
For a long time, in a world of TikTok, reels, and highlights and memes, the thought was people aren't really watching these debates. They're just trying to get a viral moment. Debates don't matter anymore. Perhaps what happened with Biden in June of 2024 might have changed some minds. Why do you think the debate still matters? Why is it such a powerful tool for personal or social change?
There's a lot that can be said about that. I think, and I'm trying to be simple about this, I think one of the simple problems is sort of paradoxical relationship between knowledge and power. And we say about education, like with knowledge is power. But what we don't say is that with that comes the risk of corruption. Okay. So our knowledge power people can manipulate us. And that's, propaganda. That's all the things that we know. But truthfully, in my experience, working around the world, the most incisive counter to that propaganda problem is the ability to directly interrogate those in knowledge power. And of course, political candidates and political office holders are among our most important knowledge power brokers. And so I think the public still, and I put this in so many editorials, they vastly want honest debate, to hear competing voices going at each other. And yes, of course, it's confusing. And of course, people will claim that the other side is being unfair. But if we give debate as it is, equal time, equal opportunity to exchange ideas, the observing public has a better opportunity to pull the truth out of that whirlwind of political campaign propaganda and what would be best for the society for the future. For me, there's little doubt of that. And I've always said, look, these conventions that are organized by the DNC and the RNC, only 10 to 18 million people watch those, okay? They are very orchestrated rhetorical events. And I'm not saying they shouldn't do them, but when you compare them to a debate, any debate they offer, it's exponentially more of the public trying to get some glimmer of what do these people really actually believe, apart from their handlers, apart from the algorithms and the manipulations that happen digitally and so on and so forth. What do they really think? I think it's a desperate cry, and we see that in the 50 to 80 million people tuning in every time trying to watch these debates.
Some people called 2024 cycle the podcast election. Could you ever imagine the thing that Gingrich was calling for back in 2012, a really, really long form debate? We're talking a 3-4 hour one where they're just sitting down and trying to hash things out.
Well, I think that was being hinted at, and it was a pivotal moment for Kamala Harris about the podcast with Joe Rogan. And I think that there was kind of a hint of that. And honestly, probably the most formative American models, like the Lincoln Douglas debates, they were 3 hours long. They were standing out there on Illinois prairies, and that's what was happening. I do think that even in a digital sense, that is possible. I think people crave authentic dialogue of different opinions. I mean, one of the things we do even in our public debate series, and this has been difficult, but to try to get professors to debate each other on campus, boy, the education, it just goes through the roof. To hear that, oh, here's this issue, but the professors disagree as knowledge brokers, that makes education so much more interesting. And that's certainly got to be true for politics, where you really get people authentically dealing with each other. I think you probably could have 3-hour podcasts with the candidates. I definitely think the 90-minute thing is a demonstration. And again, to go back to that point, I think the growing moderator consumption of that time is actually part of what's driving the frustration. I think that's something that's sort of being missed in the analysis. And just that the public, If you go back to the Kennedy-Nixon debate of 1960, they had, I forget the number, but they had 6 to 8 minute opening statements. No one is even talking that now. Why? Like, they're supposed to fix Social Security in 2 minutes. Like, no. So why did we retreat from 6 to 8 minute opening statements by candidates to these things where they only have 90 seconds to 2 minutes? And then we say, oh, that was a bad answer. They didn't explain it fully. Duh. That was our purpose, right? We tried to make them explain it badly or in a short-circuited form.
I just finished reading Fight, which tries to give the insider's details about the Kamala Harris-Donald Trump campaign. It seemed like there was some gamesmanship involved with Harris trying to get the Rogan interview, it not working out. They'd scheduled Trump for the same slot. But I think that a lot of people on both sides of the aisle looked at things like the Trump Rogan interview and the Trump Friedman interview and didn't get that much out of it. I think that if you have someone, and it could be a well-respected comedian even, that's able to sit people down and really drag answers out of them, it's tough if someone has a very specious political dodge and they're able to get away with it in a 30-second response, but not in a 5-minute response. It's very interesting. Would you ever want to moderate that?
Oh, I mean, I'm totally fishing for that every day. I really am. Like, I totally, on my X and Twitter and social media, I'm like, look, I'm available. And I did do one congressional debate. And like I said, we did host a governor's process here at SMU. I'm always trying to do that. But my thing is like, I'm probably just going to say, and literally in my ideal world, I would say to the candidates, what do you think the 5 issues are that y'all should be talking about? Okay, well, I'm just going to say immigration, abortion, Supreme Court. I'm just going to say the labels, y'all are going to talk. And I'm just going to try to make sure the system works, but it literally is not going to be about me. And that's where, I'm a little unhappy with Chris Wallace. He's like, he said it would not be about him, but he took more time than any moderator has ever taken. And again, I think he's really smart. I actually want to know what Chris Wallace thinks, but in a debate, I actually don't. Not in the role that he was taking there.
It's interesting. I think that Wallace in 16 and Wallace in 20 had very different jobs to do. I think that Wallace in 20 in particular might have represented society at that point, kind of being at the breaking point as the two candidates are actively yelling at each other. I'm not sure if there was ever more of a mutual train wreck of a debate than that. But I do have a follow-up on something you said early on, and that's Plato, Aristotle, good character, honesty. When I think about candidates that I think most of America would recognize is whether you like them or not, that person is honest, that person has integrity. Jimmy Carter might come to mind, the late Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter might have partially lost on top of stagflation issues because of things like the malaise speech, where he is aggressively honest about what he thinks that people need to hear as opposed to what they want to hear. How can we maintain that level of integrity and honesty in a partisan cycle that seems to want us to be as extreme as possible?
Yeah, I love that question. And again, I published a lot about this. I think American history is actually really good at looking at exactly that. It's probably 10 years ago, I wrote an editorial about, let's not forget that it wasn't that long ago that politicians would settle disputes with duels, like guns at dawn, and somebody would die or get shot. I mean, so there are, and of course, looking at genocide, I'm looking at things that are much worse than our most, partisan volatilities in the United States. And I try to direct people to examples in U.S. history where there is a recovery and there is something better. And I always tell students, I'm cynical about one thing: cynicism. So I'm just a raging idealist. Like, I really believe that there is within all people a potential for that better world. And I know that we are in a cycle where it's like, gosh, things are so partisan, and they are. And therefore, there cannot be any sort of mutual benefit or mutual cooperation. I don't think that's correct empirically. And I'm saying that both on like Rwanda level, but also at American politics level. I mean, one of my 2024 book, I dealt with Wilson, Harding, and Coolidge, 3 presidents back to back. And honestly, there were a lot of very similar fractures and frictions 100 years ago that were recovered. And yeah, we were talking about like Coolidge was thought to be, and he was a very calm and civil figure. Now, there are a lot of interesting things about why did that happen in 1924, and I won't get all into that. But it is possible at the bottom of the day to say, yeah, there's a basis for optimism. And I absolutely have that every day, even having done this for 30 plus years.
It's so funny that you bring up the parallels between our present moment and the Harding cycles. I think about Harding and the "Let's make America great again, return to normalcy" rhetoric, which is then co-opted by Nixon and Reagan, and then it's back this cycle as well. And it's true. Certainly, if American history does not repeat, it rhymes.
Well, and if I can interject something really quick here, here's what I found in my 2024 book that surprised me. What you just said, the phrase America first actually came out in the 1916 Wilson reelection campaign. So Harding was playing that against Wilson, and Wilson in 16, and I don't think he was being disingenuous. He tried to assure the public he would not go into World War I. And it really was an America first kind of argument from Wilson, but then the situation changed. And I mean, they didn't inaugurate until March. So in March of 17, by April, Wilson was committed to war. And that kind of thing actually happens a lot more than we realize, where people campaign. And the cynic in us says, oh, they lied. No, the situation changed and it became necessary to do this. But the America First phrase actually originates with Wilson. And that, I think, is part of the irony, but also a little bit of the optimism about why things can work out.
On that optimistic note, I've got a couple more optimistic questions. Do you have a favorite speech of all time?
I feel guilty about this question because my answer is rather cliche, but I really do love the "I Have a Dream" speech by Martin Luther King. I use it for over the last 30 years. I've used it in every single class introduction. It's become somewhat more salient for me because it's given August 28, 1963. Here at SMU, King actually spoke here in 66. And when you listen to the speech that King gave 3 years later, there's echoes of that speech that was very famously given in DC. And so there's a utility that I gain from looking at it here on the campus. I think it's an amazing speech. I think it is dealing with some very difficult issues, some issues that are violent, that are prejudicial, that involve the possible complete loss of hope, giving up on the political process, and trying to mediate a lot of different alternatives about what should happen from that point forward. And yeah, I think is a catalyst to like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I think there are substantial things that happen positively, probably because, not entirely, not exclusively, but because of that speech, August 28, 1963, that we so well know as "I Have a Dream."
Moving from speech to debate, if you could debate one historical figure, who?
That one is related to this because I think he was a factor in that speech I just talked about. But I would really love to debate Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is somebody who really, his life was transformed by debate. Ironically, while he was in jail, he was the beneficiary of a collegiate debate program that came into a prison. And he literally said, "I'm gone on debating." And I truly believe that his whole mindset was radically changed by debate. And I also think, and this is part of why I would want to debate him, I think one of the most underrated historical realities is Malcolm X's shift in opinion about civil rights between about 1960 and 1964. His moderation absolutely was a factor in his assassination. And I think that's really important, and be able to have some debate with him about like, what are you thinking? I think a lot of people believe rightly that had he not been assassinated, he would have been a massive factor and even better results than what we got. And I think we got some substantial positive results in the 60s out of the civil rights movement. But I think Malcolm X was on the verge of kind of a breakthrough, and it was threatening to the cynics that surrounded him and took his life. But I still would kind of like to debate him just to hear more about that development.
Have you ever used AI to say, you are acting as X historical figure, I'm going to debate you now, and see how accurate it seems to be to their original writings?
Oh, I need to do that. I mean, I've done some AI debate things, but I haven't done that. And I think that would be interesting. And I have to say, I mean, and maybe I'm being too cynical here, which I shouldn't, but like, I fear it would be really off track because a lot of my research delves into like, look, we don't really know. We have a misunderstanding of Malcolm X even now, just in the basic, like, I mean, there's a lot of speculation, like, well, like that the FBI killed Malcolm X. It's like, look, Thomas Hagen tells us he did do it and he's alive, like he's here. Okay. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings around Malcolm. I would be afraid, but I'd love to do it now that you say that. Like, oh yeah, I'd love to see what AI says Malcolm X would say. And again, we have some really great text in the James Farmer book I wrote in 2017. I put the full transcript of a 1962 Cornell debate between James Farmer and Malcolm X. They debated 4 times, but it's an amazing text. And we really exact transcripts of that let us know kind of what he would have debated like. So that is a fascinating idea. And I'd love to do that. I love that idea.
Well, Doctor, we've covered a lot of ground today, from rhetoric and persuasion and Plato and Aristotle and misunderstandings, competitive debate, political debate, how it's a tool for personal and social change, your favorite speech of all time, who you would want to debate. Doctor, where can people find you?
There are a lot of different avenues, very conventional social media ones. I do have a website at benvoth.com, so you can go there. I try to update that. I'm kind of running that myself. You can also look for me on LinkedIn. That's kind of how we actually connected. I do have Facebook, Instagram, and also an X Twitter account. All of those are good. My Twitter is like Benjamin Voth, my full legal name, so you can kind of look for that. But all of those regular social media outlets I'm on, and you can also look for me in different publications and things like that online. Like I said, for some of the interview we did today, there are editorials in The Hill that actually deal with in depth what we talked about.
Dr. Voth, thank you so much for your time, your understanding, your expertise. I deeply appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome, Ian. Thank you for doing these podcasts. That's amazing stuff.